Crystal skulls, urban legend or mysterious artifact. Perhaps one of the most enigmatic and debated artifacts in the world, the mysterious crystal skulls found in South America combine two realms of fascination, archaeology and gemology. Few archaeological finds have aroused as much public controversy as the Mitchell-Hedges skull, and in the world of gemology, only the Hope Diamond itself comes close to the infamy of the skull. Hollywood has forever memorialized the artifact through the Indiana Jones series. But what is the true story of the crystal skull phenomenon? Are these simply elaborate fabrications, or could they truly be artifacts of ancient and mysterious origin? That is what we hope to find out by the end of this episode. Of the innumerable crystal skulls which have supposedly been found across the world, most have been proven to be fakes. It would be incredibly difficult for us to research every single crystal skull here in order to determine the validity of the phenomenon. That being said, we will be focusing on the very first crystal skull found, and the only one of the skulls which has proven incredibly difficult to prove a fake, though not for lack of trying, and that is the Mitchell-Hedges skull. We will be investigating the history of the skull, strange features of the skull itself, and the purported high strangeness and esoteric activity that is associated with the skull today. Part 1. History and controversial discovery of the skull. The Mitchell-Hedges skull was allegedly first discovered in 1924, when a young Anna Mitchell-Hedges was lowered into a Mayan pyramid in Belize and came across the life-size quartz crystal skull. Her father, Frederick Mitchell-Hedges, was certain that it was an incredibly old Mayan artifact used in esoteric rites. This story of how Mitchell-Hedges came to have the skull, however, is highly debated. Papers have been discovered indicating that he purchased the skull at auction from a French antiques dealer named Vauban, and many use this as evidence to dismiss the skull's validity completely. Despite these seemingly authentic documents, however, it is known that Mitchell-Hedges was in possession of the skull before the 1943 auction the papers mention. In fact, it is well documented that in 1936, both Frederick Mitchell-Hedges and Vauban brought the skull to the British Museum to have it analyzed. It is also known that the two men had been close friends for some time, and it is therefore speculated that Mitchell-Hedges gave the skull to Vauban, only to purchase it back at a later date. This could be seen as a publicity stunt of sorts in an attempt to bring more attention to the artifact, as at the time it was relatively unknown. Having it featured at a large antiques market would bring a lot more attention to it than what it had previously been exposed to. In the 1960s, the skull was inherited by Anna Mitchell-Hedges after her father's death, and she began touring the United States with the skull. It was only once she began promoting the skull that it truly became public knowledge. In an attempt to prove the validity of the skull, Anna hired Hewlett-Packard to examine the skull in 1970. Hewlett-Packard, which is a company, not an individual, was considered at the time to be the world's leading researchers into quartz crystal. Today, they still work in quartz crystal, utilizing it in computers and other advanced technologies. The findings of the study were sensational. Some members of the team suggested that the crystal skull should not even exist, and none could claim to know how it could have been created with modern tools. Part 2. Hewlett-Packard's findings and unusual features. Hewlett-Packard used a variety of the finest tools available to analyze the crystal skull, including high-intensity microscopes and X-rays. However, they were unable to find any signs of machine marks on the surface of the quartz, instead finding even the internal nose cavities to be completely smooth. They also concluded that the skull had been made completely from one piece of natural quartz, and careful analysis revealed no cracks, scratches, or fractures in the matrix of the quartz. Additionally, the quartz which it was carved from was completely pure, containing not even a fleck of sand or other minerals which would have discolored it. This is incredibly uncommon and very unlikely to occur in nature. Usually this is only seen in artificially grown crystals. The level of clarity in the crystal was also unusual. It is the only alleged crystal skull to have the clarity of glass throughout, with no milky or tainted colorations, and its opacity is completely consistent through the entire skull. Another amazing feature of the crystal skull found by Hewlett-Packard, which has yet to be explained, is that the smoothing and carving of the skull goes against the grain of the crystal. All crystals have defined fault lines, and it will break along these faults if it is harshly disturbed, such as by a router or other carving tools. The Mitchell-Hedges skull goes completely against the fault lines in the crystalline structure, while not compromising the anatomical accuracy in any way to compensate. The team researching the skull was unable to theorize how this could be achieved without shattering the crystal. In addition to these unusual features, the team found the composition of the quartz to have strange properties. The quartz is pure piezoelectric silicon dioxide, while all quartz has piezoelectric qualities, not all quartz is pure piezoelectric silicon dioxide. And that type of quartz is the only type of quartz which is allowed to be used in modern-day electronics and computer chips because it has such high conductivity. It conducts electricity extremely well and can even produce its own electricity in certain circumstances. The Mitchell-Hedges skull, accordingly, was found to have both positive and negative polarity and did produce an electrical charge when under quote-unquote mechanical stress. They did not elaborate what mechanical stress was in the study that I was reading. I would be interested in knowing what kind of mechanical stress you use to test for that. The skull also exhibited highly unusual visual aspects, containing an internal prism which reflects the skull's surroundings perfectly in the interior of the eye. It is also carved in such a way that any light directed at the skull comes to a focus in the eye sockets, and you see that exhibited very well in the Indiana Jones movie as well. They focus a lot on that. Part 3. High Strangeness and Paranormal Phenomenon. The Mitchell-Hedges skull soon found its way into the budding New Age circles of the 60s and 70s, and today it is promoted more for its psychic properties than for cultural value or simply its oddity. If one visits the official website for the crystal skull, they will find that the current owners of the skull frequently meditate with and pray to the skull. They subsequently claim to receive messages from the skull during these sessions. Ironically, while I wrote this episode on July 4th, I am actually reading it on the 1st of November. So that is interesting, reading about the crystal skulls and meditation on Dia de los Muertos. Quite interesting indeed. I actually don't like that. Maybe I should have not read this one today. They subsequently claim, after having these meditations and praying sessions with the skull, to receive messages from the skull during these sessions. This ties into the supposed origin story of the skull, as Frederick Mitchell-Hedges had claimed to be told by the natives that the skull was the embodiment of all evil, and any man who possessed it could cause the death of his enemies. I would like to point out that, frankly, if I was told that a skull was the embodiment of evil, I probably wouldn't be praying to it. Just a thought. It should be noted that skull worship was highly prevalent along South American societies. We mentioned briefly in our video special on the La Llorona myth that many Aztec deities were featured as having skull faces. Even today, Santa Muerte is depicted as a skeletal figure. In the Dia de los Muertos ceremonies, sugar skulls are highly ornate skulls, now mostly fake skulls, but originally the skulls used were very real and were considered an essential way of proving to Mitchell-Hedges or Mitchell-Hedges, I still can't pronounce that, their devotion to the ancestors. Throughout human history, there have been many examples of cultures believing in ancestor worship through the worship of skulls. In Peru, skulls of the ancestors would actually be buried underneath the floorboards of the living room. The skulls were frequently cleaned and often covered with plaster to prevent the skulls from being broken. Occasionally, the skulls would also be decorated with seashells and precious stones. The Peruvians would pray to the skulls and during ceremonies would often feed them in order to appease their spirits. In India, meanwhile, skulls were frequently used in black magic and witchcraft. Various Oriental religions also believed that skulls could be used to commune with and summon the dead. That being said, the worship of any skull representation has much precedent across the globe. We need not go into detail as to the worship and supposed mystical attributes of crystal. If this skull did exist in the time of the Mayans, it is very likely that it would be worshipped, combining the significance of crystal and the skulls in general. Many who have been in the presence of the skull also claim to have witnessed events of high strangeness, and if witnessed by the Mayans, this certainly would have provoked them to believe the skull to be the embodiment of evil, as Frederick Mitchell had been told. Frank Dorland was caretaker of the skull for some time in 1960s, given the skull by Anna Mitchell-Hedges for safekeeping. And during that time, he reported many frightening occurrences. He was one of the first individuals to report these occurrences. He would often hear strange sounds, see strange lights in the vicinity of the skull, or see the skull itself glowing. These actually became so powerful and so frightening to Dorland that he began covering it with a towel whenever he was in the room for fear of what he would see. He also claimed that if he looked directly into the eyes of the skull, he would see images of pyramids and jungles within the crystal. These images were accompanied by musical metallic bells and singing, and sometimes even the sounds of rivers and waterfalls. This is not to say, however, that Dorland believed the skull had any paranormal origins or psychic power. He explained these events away by what he dubbed biocrystallography. This was defined as the interaction between the crystal and the human senses. Knowing that the skull was found in a pyramid, his mind essentially played tricks on him, he believed, transforming the glimmers and glints in the quote-unquote mass of crystal into imagery which was not actually there. He claimed this was due to a natural mirror synchronicity between the structure of crystal and the human brain. Quote, the mass of crystal in some way triggered certain reflexes in the brain to make you think that you were tasting things, hearing things, or seeing things, unquote, according to Dorland. Many individuals since Dorland have stated to have similar encounters to what he reported. While the official scientific community has concluded that the Mitchell-Hedges skull is counterfeit due to the recent discovery of very small tool etchings, the controversy around the skull is hardly quelled. I must point out here that no one claimed that they would not find tool marks eventually on the skull, as our modern technology evolves enough to be able to see it. To claim such would be to claim basically that the crystal skull somehow grew in natural processes, including into the completely accurate anatomical human life skull. And that is a claim that nobody has made to my knowledge. Everyone claims that the skull was made. It is the date of when the skull was made that has been in the question. And it has been proven already that the skull, that the tools that were available at the time simply would not be able to create the skull. So in reality, all that has been proven by the critics is that the skull was indeed carved at some point in time, and that really doesn't mean a whole lot. As always, the Phenomenophiles leaves the conclusion of whether the Mitchell-Hedges skull is a genuine ancient artifact or simply an amazing fraud, up to the reader. Nonetheless, regardless of how and when it was created, the skull does remain one of the most mysterious pieces of history ever recovered, and the craftsmanship required to create it remains unparalleled. Thank you for watching. I hope you will be joining us for our next episode. If there is anything that you would like us to cover, please respond in the comments, or you can join the new Gab page and group, which is dedicated to the Phenomenal Files. There you will find any news-related items that I post on there, updates, sneak peeks at upcoming articles and topics, and even the occasional poll.